Hello, fellow seekers and collectors. I am the Cinema Seeker.
The Force will be with you.
Always.
Star Wars Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker. The end of the Skywalker saga. 42 years worth of legacy in one movie that also has to serve as the response to The Last Jedi, answers questions from The Force Awakens, and even has to match up to the quality that The Mandalorian and the new Star Wars video game Jedi Fallen Order has essentially set. Unfortunately, it does none of those things. This film is a mess. I was hopeful for this movie, even despite the last one. But it does not come together. First big problem, the pacing. It is terrible. It goes from Kylo Ren on Mustafar, all the way to him to finding Palpatine, then darts itself to the Resistance with Finn and Poe essentially having to be escaping a bunch of TIE fighters. So it goes from there, then to Rey training with Princess Leia, then back to the Resistance where Poe and Finn meet up with each other, and then it just keeps darting along. It never takes its time. It just keeps going and going and going and doesn't really have that much brevity towards it. Compare this to the last ones that actually had those moments. Imagine if this pacing was in the originals. My god, the films would be terrible. They would. And that's really this film's biggest problem, is that it tries to match the weight of the originals, but it does not. For example, it tries to do a lot of the elements from Return of the Jedi. In fact, you could almost say this is just Return of the Jedi light or diet, depending on how you want to describe it. One of the big problems that ultimately starts is with the production. This film was marred by a bad production. Shifting directors. This is especially the big one because the director of Jurassic World was supposed to direct this one, Colin Trevorrow. If I'm saying that wrong, I apologize. He was originally supposed to direct, but then he left the production due to creative differences. What that means, I have no idea. That's like the generic Hollywood term to essentially say they disagreed with what the studio wanted, so they left or they got booted. So then Rian Johnson didn't want to come back to direct, so then J.J. Abrams was essentially forced to come back because he didn't originally want to direct this one. But he was essentially forced to because Disney had no other ones to get. That's also another big problem. Disney and Lucasfilm didn't have a plan. They didn't plan out this trilogy, and it really shows because there's so many things that they bring up in this one that either The Last Jedi contradicts or The Force Awakens contradicts. There's too many elements and essentially too many cooks in the kitchen. Just all having to write a bunch of different things. It pretty much, it's making itself up as it goes on. And yes, I realize that the original trilogy kind of had that element, but that was because it was a new trilogy. George Lucas didn't think he was going to have a sequel. He didn't know Empire or Return of the Jedi was going to be a thing, because he didn't expect Star Wars was going to be this massive phenomenon that it eventually became. It became this worldwide phenomenon, so therefore studios were like, hey, you got a sequel? It made a lot of money, and it sold a lot of toys. So, going from that to this, it's clear that this is a muddled mess of a film. Now, are there any good elements? There are a few, but the problem is that every time there's an element that's good, it immediately gets completely ruined by the lost potential, or they just go from that to then something bad. Like, first example is the lightsaber fights. They're actually pretty cool, but they're very few and far between. And the problem is that the original films had good writing to go along with it. It wasn't just, whoa, cool lightsaber fights. It was more than that. It actually had good writing. And that's unfortunately the biggest problem with these new ones, is that maybe aside from The Force Awakens, I'm one of the sometimes it seems like few that actually likes The Force Awakens. I still like it even to this day. You can hate me all you want for that, but that's just my opinion. I don't like The Last Jedi, though. Woo! That one was bad. It reads clear that these new filmmakers like Star Wars, but they don't understand Star Wars, if that makes any sense. Because the same thing happened with the Netflix Death Note movie, where the person who worked on the film was a fan, but he didn't understand it, and then we got a bad product. And unfortunately, that reads true here. That they're fans, but they don't understand it completely. Or sometimes will disregard the new lore that comes with it, or they'll have stuff that contradicts, because again, there wasn't a plan. So again, the lightsaber fights are cool, but again, but Phantom Menace had good lightsaber fights. That film is still pretty bad. Yeah. Another good element is the comedy with C-3PO. C-3PO is still really funny in this one. He really steals the show here. It's a lot of the kind of stuff that you saw like in Empire, Return of the Jedi, and even some of the prequels. It actually still does feel like the old C-3PO, and I'm happy with that. He was very funny. There were so many great one-liners, so many great jokes that came from there. It was spectacular on his part. One element that I think was actually good and kind of carried over from The Force Awakens was the camera work. I actually really liked the camera work. If there's one thing about J.J. Abrams that you can definitely give credit to his movies, is his camera work is always unique and interesting and always feels like its own. So it actually doesn't feel boring or too static. That he knows that it's an action film, so it's got to really, highlight the action and the intensity of it all. And that's something that I really give credit to him a lot, is with The Force Awakens, and even here, there's a lot of shots that I actually genuinely believe are just absolutely phenomenal and really accentuate the scene. They don't feel like it's hindered. If there's one thing I can also give credit to The Last Jedi a little bit, is the camera work in that film isn't actually bad. There's a lot of good framing, but the issue of it all is that sometimes it would get static, and it sometimes felt like the scenes were too many wide shots at times, to the point where it was like, okay, there's some parts where it could have been more personal, and J.J. Abrams really knows how to do that, so I gotta give him a lot of credit. He did a great job in terms of having the camera aid in its storytelling. Genuinely good. Camera aid in its storytelling. Genuinely good. But the bad elements are there, and unfortunately there are too many of them. Again, I already mentioned the bad pacing, but the script, oh god, the script, it's so bad. There are so many unanswered questions in this film. As I said in the beginning, there were so many questions still left unanswered from The Force Awakens, and not to mention it has to essentially act as kind of a retcon for The Last Jedi, because Rian Johnson just essentially ruined a lot of the good elements from The Force Awakens, or any genuine mystery from the previous film. So now you're talking about a script that has to be a wrap up of an entire franchise that's comprised of 6 movies, but also has to be a response to the last one, and in many ways try to fix. And then it doesn't help that you have the scriptwriter of Batman vs. Superman, Chris Terrio. I'm not trying to insult the guy, but I think he should probably stick to maybe smaller fare than these big open lord universes, because it's clear he can't handle too many elements in one movie, because a lot of the criticisms from this film came up in Batman vs. Superman. And I feel like I'm one of the few people that doesn't mind the movie, that doesn't think it's the worst comic book film of all time. There are far worse. Batman and Robin, anybody? But again, a lot of those bad elements from Batman vs. Superman carry over into the Rise of Skywalker. And that's really where the big problem is it does not have focus. It never says, this is where we're starting, this is where we are in the middle, and this is where we are at the end. It's constantly on this zigzag line of going back and forth. It also doesn't help that there's not much tension in the film, because a lot of the characters are pretty overpowered to a point where it's almost ridiculous. Like, they go into a Star Destroyer and just start mowing down a bunch of people left and right, which you have seen in the trailers. But all of a sudden, but again, in the originals, the Stormtroopers were kind of a threat, at least. Yeah, there is the joke that they can't hit anything for worth. I mean, I bet you anything if they saw, even a bug, they'd probably miss it. But at least in the original, there were times where they did pose a threat. Here, they're just cannon fodder for our characters to just pew, 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 pew. Just, yeah, drop that one on the left, pew, pew. It's over and done with, and it never has this level of oh man, are they gonna get out of it? Ooh, tension. You need tension in your films. And unfortunately, this doesn't have it. It's the same with Rey as a character. She's very underdeveloped. And that's also a big problem. A lot of these characters don't get development, except for Poe. But we'll get to that later. But most of them don't have that much character development. Finn is so wasted in this film. He is genuinely not given barely anything to do aside from Rey, Rey. He just screams Rey all the time. And that pretty much could sum up his character arc. Just screaming that character's name when he's literally a stormtrooper who escaped from the First Order. That's so interesting. Why wasn't that a big part of the film? But the last film wasted his character, and then this film, ironically, as a response to it, does the same thing. And that's just absolutely hilarious and ironic. Overall opinion, Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker is a bad film. It's not good. It's not very well written. It's not edited great. The pacing is off. There are some cooler elements, and yes, it is better than The Last Jedi, but that's not saying much. So overall, The Rise of Skywalker is really only recommended if you're just a Star Wars fan. If you want to end the Skywalker saga because you've seen all the other ones, then go ahead and watch it. But if you're not a big Star Wars fan, or even somebody who has been hating these last ones and wants to see if it's worth checking out, don't even bother. You're not gonna be satisfied. You will be very disappointed and even at times angry. From that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. There's the like and dislike button if you didn't like it. And of course, there's the subscribe button. I've been the Cinema Seeker. Peace out.